3 men ran Stalin's secret police. All 3 built their careers on the same currency: fear, forced confessions, and a bullet to the back of the head for anyone who got in the way. 2 of them died exactly that way, arrested by the organization they used to command, tried in secret, shot. The third, Lavrentiy Beria, outlived Stalin. He helped build the Soviet atomic bomb. He sat on the Politburo for 15 years while everyone else around him was fed into the machine. He looked untouchable. But why did Stalin keep him alive isn't quite the right question. The better one is how close Beria actually came to not surviving at all, and what finally caught up with him 4 months after the man protecting him was gone. To understand what made Beria different, you have to understand the job itself. And the job had a body count before Beria ever walked into the building. The NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, was created on July 10, 1934. On paper, it was a government ministry. In practice, it became Stalin's instrument for finding enemies, real or invented, and removing them. Its first chief was Genrikh Yagoda. 5 months into the job, in December of 1934, Leningrad party boss Sergei Kirov was shot dead in his own office. Whether Stalin had a hand in planning it is still disputed among historians. Even a Soviet government commission that investigated the killing in 1989 couldn't establish his involvement. What's not disputed is what happened next. Stalin used the murder as the pretext for a nationwide hunt for terrorists, and Yagoda's NKVD carried it out. Within 3 years, that hunt had become the Great Terror. Yagoda built the machinery for it: the show trials, the labor camps, the systems of forced confession, and ran the arrest and execution of Soviet officials the world had once considered untouchable, men who'd stood beside Lenin himself. None of that saved him. By 1936, Stalin wanted the terror to move faster than Yagoda was pushing it. In September, he was removed and replaced with a man who owed nothing to the NKVD's existing staff. 6 months later, Yagoda was arrested. The charges: treason, espionage, conspiracy, even, according to the indictment, a plot to poison his own successor. He stood trial in March of 1938, alongside Nikolai and other former Bolshevik leaders. 2 days after the verdict, on March 15th, Genrikh Yagoda was shot. He was 46 years old. His successor was Nikolai Yezhov, a small man, barely 5 feet tall. Where Yagoda had built the machine, Yezhov floored the accelerator. Under his command, the terror stopped being selective. It accelerated into what Soviet citizens would later call, bitterly, the Yezhovshchina, Yezhov's time. Historians still argue about the exact numbers because so many archives stayed sealed for decades. But even the conservative estimates are staggering. A single mass arrest directive Yezhov signed in the summer of 1937. Historians cite it today by its file number, Order 447, led to roughly 387,000 executions in 16 months. Across the wider terror of 1937 and 1938, nearly all of it under Yezhov's signature, researchers put the death toll at approximately 700,000 people. By 1938, Yezhov was unraveling. Colleagues described him drinking through the workday, increasingly erratic, and Stalin had already brought in his replacement. Lavrentiy Beria arrived that summer, officially as Yezhov's deputy, unofficially to build the case against him. He didn't waste time. By September, he controlled the NKVD's State Security Directorate. By the end of November, Yezhov was finished, and Beria had his job. Then, in April of 1939, Yezhov was arrested, tortured into a confession that implicated dozens of his own relatives and friends, most of whom were then executed as well. On February 4th, 1940, Nikolai Yezhov was shot in a Moscow prison. He was 44. 2 men, 2 death sentences, both signed by the same government they had spent years killing for. Stalin kept his hands clean. His police chiefs did not. Beria didn't build his career the way Yagoda or Yezhov did. He'd spent nearly 2 decades running the security apparatus in his native Georgia, working up to first secretary of the Georgian Communist Party, a regional power base that was his own, not a Kremlin appointment. That mattered later. For now, what mattered was what he did with Yezhov's old job. His first act in office wasn't more terror. It was less. He released tens of thousands of prisoners. Estimates range from 100,000 to 200,000 people let out of the labor camps. He curtailed some of the worst interrogation methods, at least on paper, and he made sure everyone understood exactly who was responsible for the excesses of the previous 2 years. Not the party, not Stalin, Yezhov. It's tempting to call this reform. Don't. Beria wasn't softening the system. He was stabilizing it and purging Yezhov's loyalists out of the NKVD to make room for his own people. The killing didn't stop. It got more targeted and more efficient. 2 years later, in March of 1940, Beria personally wrote the memo authorizing the execution of roughly 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intellectuals. A mass killing that would take its name from one of the forests where the bodies were found, Katyn. He didn't delegate it to a directive buried under other signatures. He proposed it in his own hand, and the Politburo approved it within days. This was not a man who'd discovered a conscience. This was a man who understood, better than his predecessors ever had, that survival in Stalin's Soviet Union meant being useful in more than one way. So why did Beria last 15 years in a job that had killed the 2 men before him in an average of 2? Start with geography and blood. Beria was Georgian, like Stalin, and like the power base he'd already built for himself in Tbilisi before he ever set foot in Moscow. The historian Simon Sebag Montefiore has argued that Stalin trusted the ruthless political traditions of the Caucasus and trusted a fellow Caucasian to enforce them. That's an interpretation, not a fact you can date. But it lines up with something Stalin reportedly called Beria at the Yalta Conference in 1945, introducing him to President Roosevelt. My Himmler. Then there's usefulness, and this is where Beria pulled decisively ahead of everyone who came before him. He wasn't just running secret police. During the war, he sat on the State Defense Committee, the small emergency body actually directing the Soviet war effort. He controlled the forced labor economy building roads, mines, and weapons. And on August 7th, 1945, the day after the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Stalin handed him one more job: build a Soviet bomb. It wasn't a job Beria was qualified for on paper. He wasn't a physicist. What he was the one man in the Soviet Union who could get resources moved, scientists protected instead of arrested, and stolen intelligence, funneled in partly through networks that included the British physicist and Soviet spy Klaus Fuchs, turned into an actual working weapon without anyone above him asking questions he didn't want asked. He terrified the scientists under him as much as he terrified everyone else. By some accounts, when he watched the country's first nuclear reactor go critical, his reaction wasn't excitement. It was suspicion. Is that all? But this once, the terror built something instead of only destroying it. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear device at a test site in Kazakhstan. Stalin now had a deterrent against the United States, and the man who delivered it was the same man running his secret police, his labor camps, and a large share of his wartime logistics. You can replace a man who tortures confessions out of prisoners. Stalin proved that twice. It's a lot harder to replace the one person holding together your secret police, your forced labor economy, and your nuclear weapons program all at once in the opening years of the Cold War. None of that made Beria untouchable. It just made him expensive to remove. By the early 1950s, there are signs Stalin's trust was running out, the same signs that had preceded Yagoda's fall and Yezhov's. The pattern, each time, started the same way, not with an arrest, but with an attack on the network underneath the target. In November of 1951, that pattern reappeared in Georgia, Beria's home ground. Soviet investigators accused senior Georgian officials, most of them Beria loyalists, men he'd placed himself, of running a secret nationalist conspiracy. Historians call it the Mengrylian affair. By the time it ran its course, the one advantage none of Beria's NKVD predecessors ever had, a power base of his own, outside Stalin's direct control, had been cut out from under him. Then, in January of 1953, came something bigger. Soviet newspapers announced that a group of Kremlin doctors, most of them Jewish, had been arrested for plotting to poison the country's top leadership. It became known as the Doctors' Plot. Several historians who've studied the surviving record believe it was never really about doctors. It followed the same shape as the Mengrylian case before it, and the cases against Yagoda's and Yezhov's own circles before their falls. Isolate the network first, arrest the man later. And unlike the two purges before it, this one was still accelerating, not winding down, when the one man who could have ordered it to stop suddenly couldn't. We'll never know for certain. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died before any of it could play out. Beria didn't mourn. According to the historian Simon Sebag Montefiore, while others in the room wept over Stalin's body, Beria looked radiant, glistening with ill-concealed relish. Within weeks, he'd had the Doctors' Plot publicly declared a fabrication and the surviving prisoners released. He reversed the Mengrylian case. For a few months in the spring of 1953, the most feared man in the Soviet Union looked like he might become its next reformer or its next dictator. Possibly both. Some historians take the reformer half seriously, pointing to real proposals he floated for loosening Soviet control over Eastern Europe as evidence he might have genuinely changed course. Most don't buy it. They read the same moves as exactly what Beria had always been good at, reading the room and doing whatever kept him in power for one more year. He never got the chance to settle the argument. On June 26, 1953, less than 4 months after Stalin's death, Beria walked into a presidium meeting expecting routine business. Instead, Nikita Khrushchev stood up and accused him of working for British intelligence. By multiple accounts, Beria's response was somewhere between confusion and disbelief. It didn't matter. Georgy Malenkov pressed a signal button on his desk. Armed officers under Marshal Georgy Zhukov were already waiting in the next room. What happened after that arrest is where the record itself starts to blur. Fittingly, for a man whose career was built on making inconvenient facts disappear. The official version: he was held for nearly 6 months, tried in secret that December, alongside 6 of his closest deputies, with no public defense and no appeal, and shot on December 23, 1953. He was 54 years old, but Beria's own son later claimed a different version, that his father was killed at, or shortly after, the moment of arrest in June, and that the December trial was staged around a body double to give the new leadership's power grab the appearance of due process. Historians remain divided on which version is true. What almost nobody disputes is the irony sitting underneath either one. The system that ended Beria, manufactured charges, a closed tribunal, a bullet with no appeal, was the exact one he'd spent 15 years perfecting. The only thing that changed was who was holding the gun. That machine never spared Beria. It just hadn't gotten to him yet. Once Stalin stopped protecting him, it did.